It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Okay, so people who are concerned about poverty and inequality and social policy have long known that the United States has high poverty rates, higher than those seen in a lot of other rich countries. That fact has been widely reported since the late 1980s based on data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, from data from the European Union, and from LIS, the institute that I direct, a small research institute located indeed in Luxembourg, the much dissed Luxembourg. And I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So for our brief report for this State of the Union, my colleague Marcus Yanti and I took a closer look at this claim that poverty is high in the United States relative to other countries, and our goal was to deepen that claim and to extend it in several ways. So first, we explored this one particular question, which is this very high rate of poverty that we see in the US, is this typical of all countries or just of high-income countries? The second thing that we did was to look at multiple definitions of poverty, which I'll come back to. We looked at the US in comparative perspective, considering income that households receive from the market, that's mostly earnings, a little bit of income from capital, as well as the much more widely used indicator that we call disposable income, and that's income that households have after we take account of Social Security and income taxes paid out and income transfers from government that are received. We also asked if the US's high rate of poverty is if it still holds when we take standard of living into account. So is it possible, for example, that people in the United States relative to other countries, compared to other countries, are more likely to be poor relative to other Americans, but they're less likely, or their poverty is less intense when we consider the actual standard of living across countries? So we're going to ask that question as well. The other thing that we did in this report is to look at a fair amount of detail descriptively at variation within the United States, to ask the question if the risk factors that drive up individual and household likelihood of poverty, if we see those same risk factors essentially taking the same shape across countries. So we wanted to know, once again, if we look at the economic outcomes for particular subgroups, one thing is that it helps us understand how national policies and institutions are mitigating or not mitigating poverty. So in my little time today, I'm going to give you some highlights. I realize I'm echoing slightly. And I'm going to focus just this presentation on variation in disposable income, that is after taxes and transfers, but I'll make a few points as I go along about the way that redistribution shapes up. Okay, just a couple more things before I actually show you some numbers. So let me just offer a roadmap to what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you in just a minute 6 graphs that show you where the U.S. stacks up in terms of poverty. First, I'm going to show you vis-a-vis a group of 34 countries, 25 high-income countries, and 9 middle-income countries. Adding middle-income countries to comparative studies is fairly new in this world of poverty research that David referred to. And after that, I'm going to then drop down to 20 countries, which are all high-income countries. Those make the most sense in terms of policy comparison. It also happens that the data, all of these countries have data that are especially detailed that enable us to look at redistribution. So I'm going to then, among those 20, show you what we've learned in terms of both relative and absolute levels of poverty. And then I'm going to look at 4 risk factors: age, household structure, educational attainment, and indeed attachment to paid work. And in each case, we're going to ask, are the individual and household factors that make Americans more likely to be poor, or is there something unique about those? Are they unique to the US, or are these patterns fairly universal? You'll note that I'm not going to show anything about race and odd omission in the United States, of course, but that's because it's nearly impossible to make sense of racial disparities within country, racial disparities across countries. So maybe we can come back to that in the questions. Okay, just a couple of terms then before I reveal some pictures. The data indeed come from LIS, used to be called the Luxembourg Income Study. We shortened the name to LIS a few years ago. It's a 33-year-old data archive located in Luxembourg. There's a satellite office at the City University of New York. What we do at LIS, we do now, and we've done for many years. I've been there for over 25 years. We gather data sets from around the world, now from over 50 countries. And data sets that focus on income and labor market outcomes. Some of them have wealth as well, and we harmonize them into a common template so that they can be used for comparative research across countries and over time, and so that as best as possible, the income definitions and the concepts are the same. Okay, as I talk, I'm going to use the term Americans, but what I really mean are persons resident in the United States, a bit of a sloppy usage. Also, everything I'm going to show you once again now is based on disposable income. Again, that's after taxes and transfers have been taken account. And everything I'm going to show you also uses a relative poverty measure, except for one where I'll tell you when I get there. What do I mean by that? In cross-national studies, it's very common to measure poverty relative to within-country standards of living. It's most often, at least using the LIS data, people define a household as poor if that household has income after taxes and transfers less than 50% of the median within that same country. Okay, so we can come back to that later if anyone's interested. It's important to note that this is a measure of income, I think that's important and valuable, but it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include the value of health, housing, or education services that might be consumed and enjoyed by households. It doesn't take account of indirect taxes paid out, sales taxes, and it doesn't take account of assets or debt, all of which are extremely important. But still, this measure of income, it's cash and near cash income, it is a key indicator of well-being. And when income is low, when people experience income poverty, that poverty nearly always indicates hardship and sometimes very substantial hardship. Okay, so here's the first picture here. Using the income measure that I just described, this graph reports poverty rates, relative poverty, using that 50% of the median standard across 34 countries. Using this income measure and this poverty definition in 2010, everything I'm showing you is income in 2010. The surveys were done in 2011 for the most part. So there's two key things I want you to see in this picture here. One is that this well-known exceptionalism, the high rate of US poverty here at 16%, it pertains to the rich countries. It's not a universal result, perhaps not so surprising, but again, remember this is relative poverty. Most of the middle-income countries in the study report higher relative poverty than what we see in the US. Countries with greater relative poverty include 5 Latin American countries, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, and Peru, and likewise Georgia, the country of Georgia, and the country of South Africa. The second thing that we do throughout the report, I'm not going to say too much now, is look at clusters of countries. That's a well-known approach in social science because we know that countries tend to cluster in terms of welfare state models, or what David referred to as regimes. And here we do see that poverty tends to vary fairly systematically across some of these well-known groups of countries. In general, the highest poverty rates, again, this is relative poverty, are seen in the Latin American countries. 3 groups of countries, more moderate poverty rates, the Southern European countries, the English-speaking or Anglophone countries, which include the US, those tend to be the liberal welfare states, again, that David mentioned, and Eastern European countries. In general, an important finding, one that many of us have focused on for a long time, is that poverty rates in continental Europe, and especially the usual suspects, the Nordic countries, the poverty rates in these countries are less. These countries produce, I would say, substantially less poverty. Just briefly, a third result that isn't shown in this picture but that we talk about, there's a technique that we often use at LIS and people who use our data use, and that is that we can look, it's an accounting exercise essentially, an analytic exercise. We look at poverty or inequality using the market income, meaning looking at what people take in from earnings and a little bit from capital. And then we look again, essentially, again, it's a statistical technique because obviously households only really have one portfolio of income. But we look again after Social Security income taxes have been subtracted and other cash transfers have been added. And that allows us to ask a very particular question. So this high rate of disposable income poverty that we see in the US, what's driving it up in cross-national perspective? Is it a high rate of market income poverty, or is it a meager level of redistribution, or is it both? And what we found for this study, in most of the subgroups, while market income poverty is high, it's the meager level of redistribution that's really driving the high result in the US. Okay, so then the question it comes up about standard of living. What about poverty with respect to real income levels, which is often called absolute poverty? So we calculate for this, I hope you can see in this picture, we calculate here poverty rates using the exact same income definition, but 2 different thresholds. On the horizontal axis is what you just saw, relative poverty, using the 50% standard. On the vertical axis, we took the US poverty line, the official poverty line, and converted across countries using price-adjusted exchange rates. And then we can ask the question again, now we're going to compare everybody's income to this same US, or in this case it's the US, we could have done it with any other country's line, but to the same poverty threshold. And using that line, we see something a little bit different. So if we focus on the US line, the vertical axis, disposable income in the US by this measure is about 9%. The absolute poverty rate is, of course, or not surprisingly, higher in 10 middle-income countries. It's also higher in 11 other high-income countries, including all the Eastern European and Southern European countries. Again, not surprising, right? These are less affluent countries. I think what is more surprising and less well-known in the US is that absolute poverty in the US is higher than in several other high-income countries. American poverty using the US line exceeds that reported in all of the other Anglophone countries. The exception is the UK, as well as in all the Nordic and continental cases. And most of these countries are less affluent than the United States. So in cross-national terms, to sum that up, American poverty stands out, and that's true among the richest countries for both relative and absolute poverty. Okay, age matters. Being a child, not such a good thing if you don't want to be poor. In our contribution to the State of the Union, we report that American children, like all Americans, are more likely to be poor than our children in the comparison countries. We also asked the question, are children disproportionately poor? Are they more likely to be poor than other people in the same country? And is that pattern, which we knew existed in the US, is that relatively universal, across, or at least across these 20 countries? That's clearly not the whole universe. It's often noted that American children are at greater risk of poverty, as we noted, and indeed, using the data that we have here and this relative poverty measure, we find that American children are, remarkably, maybe not so remarkable to those of you who already knew, 30% more likely to live in poverty than are Americans on the whole. That wasn't the case historically, but it's been the case since the middle 1970s. Is this a widespread pattern? It is widespread. In about 3/4 of these 20 rich countries, children's poverty risk is higher than that of all persons within their same country. It's lower in only 4 countries, again, the usual suspects, the Nordic countries of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and by a smaller margin in the UK, partly because of a very effective anti-child poverty campaign in the UK that some of you might know about. I think we can note that American institutions and policies are not serving American children especially well relative to Americans as a whole, but the US is not unique in that regard. So now I'm going to just run through a couple of other, again, descriptive sort of risk factors. So the next thing is, sorry, I lost my sheet here. This is looking at household structure. Okay, hold on just one second, sorry. Another stylized fact, something that we know about the United States, is that persons in households headed by single mothers are at high risk of poverty. Here we see that Americans living in single mother households are indeed at high risk of poverty. Fully 37% are poor, again, the highest among the 20 countries. Not surprisingly, we're going to keep seeing that pattern. Our results reveal that Americans in 2-parent households are also at comparatively high risk of poverty, although the US outcome, about 10%, is not as exceptional as it is among the households headed by single mothers. Persons in 2-parent households in all the Southern European countries are actually more likely to be poor than their US counterparts. So overall, while the magnitudes vary across countries, we do see a somewhat similar pattern, universal pattern. In all 20 countries, persons in households headed by a single mother are more likely to be poor both before and after taxes and transfers than are persons in households headed by 2 parents. And it's also the case when we look at poverty reduction, the difference between market income and disposable income poverty. Poverty reduction is in fact greater in single-parent households in all countries than it is in the 2-parent households, but not extensive enough to equalize poverty at the end of the day, that is, to equalize poverty rates between among people in these 2 different types of households. Education. Education matters, not surprisingly, and again, I keep saying that this is somewhat descriptive, not surprising, there's the US, I give it a red star for the high level of poverty there. One's economic prospects, including the risk of being poor, are of course shaped by another factor, one's own educational attainment. And in this graph, we report poverty rates for working age people, 25 to 59, with low versus high levels of education. The report shows a medium as well. Low means less than secondary, essentially less than high school, and high means a college attainment, completed college attainment. So the US result, while not entirely exceptional, also is notable. Among those with the lowest attainment, Americans are again the most likely to be poor. About 38% of those in that educational group are poor. Among those with the highest attainment, Americans are the 5th likeliest to be poor. So to sum up, in the US, those with the least education are more than 6 times as likely to be poor, meaning to live in a poor household, as are those with the most education. That ratio is exceeded in a few countries, only 3 actually. So in the US, as everywhere, education matters, and again, it matters a lot. It especially matters in the United States. Okay, the last snapshot, paid work. We all have heard, obviously, we all know and take it for granted that working for pay, and especially commanding medium or high earnings, or I should say not being in the low-wage labor market, is a poverty prevention tool. Is that reliably the case in the United States and elsewhere, and for whom? In this figure, we report disposable income poverty rates for those with 0 earnings, that's the high bar, and the middle bar, those with low earnings, and the lowest bar, the yellow, of course those poverty rates are very low, are for those with higher earnings. What does that mean? We defined higher earnings, medium high earnings, as earnings in the top 2/3 of the earnings distribution in one's own country and within one's own gender. As with educational attainment, we find some universal patterns, of course. Everywhere for men and women alike, the risk of poverty falls as one's own attachment to the labor market increases from none to low to medium high. And the gradient is steep across all countries and country clusters. Let me point out a finding that is not in this picture, but it's in the report. So obviously having no income, no market income, places earnings is what I mean to say. Having no earnings is associated with a higher risk of being poor. And paradoxically, that's actually more true for men than it is for women. That's because, right, earnings, that's an individual level characteristic. People live in households. In all 20 countries, among people with no earnings, men are substantially more likely to be poor than are their female counterparts. And that finding reflects two things. One is persistent gender divisions of labor, right, in paid work. So women with no earnings are more likely to be partnered with are more likely to have a partner with earnings than is the reverse, right? Households are important cushions against low and no earnings. Also, women are more likely to have co-resident children and then are eligible for income transfers that are conditioned on the presence of kids. So to sum up, in the US, those with no earnings as a group are substantially more likely to be poor than are those with earnings in the bottom third of the distribution, and non-earners are vastly more likely to live in poverty than high earners. That's a general pattern across these countries. Okay, so to close, to sum a couple of things in our report, we find that using a relative poverty standard and considering disposable household income, the US poverty rate exceeds that reported in all the other high-income countries in our study, with the sole exception of Israel. At the same time, the well-known exceptionalism of American relative poverty is not a universal result. Most of the middle-income countries in this study report higher relative poverty rates than what we find in the United States. Our results help us to understand more fully what drives the comparatively high rate of US relative disposable income poverty. For most groups, the high rate of poverty in the United States is driven more by meager poverty reduction than it is by high rates of market income poverty. The only countries, that reduce poverty, among the non-elderly that is, via taxes and transfers less than the US, are 4 Latin American countries plus Israel and Taiwan has very little market income poverty to reduce. And finally, then, we find that national level policies and institutions do play a major role in shaping poverty outcomes. Returning to that first graph and considering relative poverty, we see that on average, the Anglophone countries produce more poverty. The US is high among the Anglophone countries. They produce more poverty than Eastern European, continental, and Nordic countries, but less poverty, relative poverty than in Southern Europe and in the Latin American countries. I think that one lesson is clear. Americans, scholars, policymakers, and the general public should look abroad for lessons about poverty and poverty reduction, lessons that are both inspirational and cautionary. Thank you.